So just looking at where people are at from Friday, I have decided to extend the lab due date to tomorrow. So you can still finish anything up that you've got left to do on those. I do want to actually go over some of those, realize that maybe there's some things that maybe need to be talked about again, or maybe delve deeper in that. So I actually want to go through and just build the MPG calculator today, just to make sure that we see that whole process and make sure that everybody's on the same page. The other thing I noticed is, I remember the smooth scroll thing, the code that I got for that was relatively easy to find, but I forgot I had to make some changes to it. So anyway, I'll be providing you the code that I've got to set up smooth scrolling, because that's not really the focus of that assignment. So I'll just be giving you the code that I've written for that, and we'll run through that. But basically that was just a, hey, go review jQuery, make sure you still remember how to use jQuery, go find it online. I think that your textbook in first semester did cover smooth scrolling at some point. I don't know how much you used it on assignments. I don't think any assignments required it. I think the way that they showed you how to do it was using a special plugin, some third-party JavaScript tool, but really it's just a few lines of JavaScript to get it built yourself. So I'll show you how I would set that up.
Thanks for extending it.
So no problem there. So yeah, so that's extended for everybody. So Evan, we'll talk about extending the other stuff.
Sweet.
But the labs are already extended till tomorrow.
And that was the 2 web apps, and then there's a single page.
So I already reopened the homework, the 1C. So that's due tomorrow. And so you'll have the lab sheet, the homework 1C, and then I need to get your party invites, because I think last time I checked you hadn't pushed it.
Oh, right.
So I still need to get that. Okay, so cool. All those 3 things, as long as you get them to me tomorrow, by beginning of class tomorrow, I won't count a penalty on that. Okay. All right, so let's go through building up this, building up the MPG calculator. Unfreeze the screen here. Pop into Visual Studio. And let me open up the lab assignment. Okay. So, if you looked at the assignment, first thing, what do we want to call the project according to the assignment? What did I ask you to call it? So I asked you to call it experiment. Okay. So I'm going to create a new project called experiment. Create new project. Project type is web. So that's where we're going to find it. Make sure that you're picking ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework again. I'm going to type in experiment for both the name of the project and the name of the solution. For me, I'm just going to put it on the desktop because I already have a version of this. Okay. Empty project type, check the MVC box. And go ahead and check that. Now, for some of you, I know you've been having issues with some of you. If you check the box to allow that cert, you should be going fine with HTTPS. If you didn't check that, you may want to uncheck this so it's just running over HTTP, depending on how you have it set up. I'm going to go ahead and leave that checked. That'd be the preferred way.
You said select HTTPS.
You may, depending on if you have issues with it. You know, I would recommend having it checked to make sure that it works over HTTPS, because if you don't have that checked, you're not going to find some issues. Like, hey, I've got jQuery running over HTTP. Well, you're not going to know that if you're running HTTP. You would know that if you're running HTTPS, because it'll say, hey, I can't find that JavaScript file, right? So I'd recommend going over HTTPS, but that's kind of up to you. Okay, so we got a brand new project, right? So looking at the assignment, what's maybe the first place I should start to set this project up? I'd actually recommend starting with the model. Generally recommend starting with the model in an MVC context to figure out what data you need. And we'll get to that later because there's some additional features built into Visual Studio where actually if you create the model first, it will actually go create the controller and the views based on that model that you've created. So it actually will create the code both for the controller and the views as long as you create the model first. So that's another reason why we want to create the model first. So as far as what should be in the model, what do you think I should put in there? How many fields do you think I need?
Just one.
Just one? Why just one?
Because the only thing we want to know is the Fahrenheit to convert.
Somebody else?
We're doing the temp convert, not the MPG.
Oh, sorry. MPG.
So
Sorry,
three.
I was looking at the wrong one. MPG. So how many? Three?
Three.
I had
Why three? Yeah?
six.
So you can do it as 3 or 6, okay? Either is a valid option. So if I do it as 3, I still need to send these 3 values to the view somehow, right? So if I don't put those 3 values into the model, how do I have to send them to the view? ViewBag, right? So I can either add these 3 things to ViewBag, or I can add those 3 things to the model. That's a design decision, right? That really depends on what you're building and other constraints. For my purpose, I'm actually going to add all 6 of those to my model to keep it simple. But that will depend on what your other constraints are, right? So going back to the project, I'm going to create a new model. Say model, add a new class. What I call this is just a name, but what I'm going to call it is MPG Calc model. The reason I'm doing that is I just want to remember which controller it goes with. And in this case, that controller only really ever uses one model. So call it the same thing as what I'm going to call the controller. Keep it easy. So to that, I'm going to add a few parameters. Yep.
Are you generally going to have a control for each model you make? You label them in?
Yes.
Okay.
Generally speaking, there's a one-to-one between models and controllers. That's not always the case, but generally is and generally should be. But that's not always the case, okay? So MVC doesn't require me to have a one-to-one relationship there, basically, but it does make it usually easier to follow the code and have that auto-generated process work well, as long as you have that relationship of one model to one controller. So this is the way I'm going to set that up. I've got miles driven, gallons used, price per gallon. That's all my inputs. And then I've got my 3 outputs there. One thing to note, and I did talk with most of you about this, note that I've got a little question mark there. Does anybody remember why I put that question mark there and why it's important?
Make it nullable.
Okay, make it nullable. That's what it does. What happens if I don't have it there?
If there isn't a value in that field when you submit it, then it will crash.
No.
It'll still run, won't
Because it can't be null by default.
Can't be null by default. So a few things are going to happen. If I give it this model to start with, I'm gonna potentially start with zeros in the fields instead of starting with them blank. Right? If I give it this model to start with, which I can show you how I would do that, if I give it to start with, these are going to be 0 already in there. I want them to start out blank. I want to force the user to actually enter something. The other thing that happens is if I don't make these nullable and the user submits something, if they leave the field blank or they put just garbage letters in there, it's going to come in as 0. And I won't be able to tell whether they put a valid value or whether they put 0. Right? So the big reason why I want to make those nullable is to know for sure whether or not the user put in a value. Pretty much all of your, anytime you're building a model for MVC, you want to make sure every input allows for null. Every input should allow for null, whether that's because it's a reference type such as string that already allows null, or it's because it's a primitive type that you made nullable.
This is something else. So is the MG Calc model, is that like a naming convention to have model at the end of?
That's just what I'm coming up with.
Okay.
So that's what I'm coming up with this because it's not really tied to a database directly, right? So if I have something that's tied to a database and say it's product, I'm just going to call this class product. If I have it tied to the database and it's a project, right, which is what you're going to do for your portfolio, I'm just going to call that class project. So usually I just call that class based on what it is and don't add a suffix. I'm just doing that here to keep it easier to figure out what's going on there, because MPG Calc as a name looks kind of weird.
Okay, yeah.
You know, am I talking about the model? Am I talking about the controller? Am I talking about the view? So that just makes the code easier to read in this case. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You also isn't exactly a real world object that's comparable to it.
Right. It's not something I'm storing in the database. It's just what are the inputs for this form, right? So that's why I'm doing that. Does that make sense? So that's not something when we get, especially when we get to databases, we won't add the word model. And I'm not going to expect you to add the word model to the end of yours. But for now, it's a reasonable, for things like this, it's a reasonable way to go about it. So, all right. So I've made those things nullable. That's important that these three are nullable. Now, let's go create that controller. Add controller. I'm going to create an empty controller. I'm going to call this one MPG Calc controller. Okay. Now initially there's nothing in there. Let me just show you real quickly. I'm going to set up, well, we'll come back to it. I need to set up the view first. So I've got a basic controller there. I'm going to add the view. I'm going to actually call this view index simply because of this controller really only having one page. That's going to make the URLs the nicest.
Wait,
Yep.
selected use a layout.
Oh, I did.
Well, at least now you have Bootstrap installed.
Yeah. Except those Bootstrap 3. There. Okay. So I've already written the code for this form, so I'm actually just going to copy it over. Well, I'll go through it. I'll go through why the pieces.
The index or view?
Yep. Sorry, got distracted. Yes, it should be index. Index, make sure I'm not using a layout page. Just a fair forewarning, when we hit chapter 5, we'll actually start using layout pages. So that'll be either tomorrow or the day after, depending on how today goes, or something. So we'll get to that this week. Okay, so I'm going to set the model as being MPG Calc model. So that's what I need there. I'm going to go ahead and set up the header for the page, that title. I'm going to go ahead and add that bootstrap CSS file. I want to put that whole thing in a container, so I'm going to start with that. I'm going to use main. Anybody remember what the semantics of that main tag is? What's that for? And how is it different than a div?
You should only have one main tag on the page.
Yep, every page should only ever have one main. I can have as many divs as I want. Is there any difference between a main tag and a div tag?
Doesn't the main like show you like the main content of the page? Like
Mhm.
maybe Google will look at that tag and say, this is your.
Yes, it's a hint for SEO as far as search engines go. They're going to look for main, and that's what they want to index, is everything in main, and ignore everything that's outside of main because it's not interesting to a search engine. That's one. So everything that's specific to this page, right? I don't want to put nav bars in there. I don't want to put footers in there because those are on every page. Those aren't interesting. The main is to give the search engine some sort of indication of what's important to my page, right? So the main content of the page. Specifically, once we get to layouts, this part here that's in main is the only part that we're actually going to start putting in our views. We'll get to that in chapter 5. But the only part that we'll actually be putting in our pages is going to be what's inside main. The rest of that we're going to move somewhere else. Okay, so now I need to open up a form. Actually, I'm going to put a header on here first, just so we know, hey, what page am I on? So I'm going to put a H1 header on there, and then I'm going to start putting in that form. So just as a reminder, we want to make sure that we wrap that form in that begin form. What's that going to do as far as the HTML is concerned?
It's going to start basically in a form tag.
Right, it's going to put it in a form tag. Right, that's going to create a form tag, and it's going to be wrapped around everything that's in our form. Okay, I'm going to go and start adding those fields, and I actually have them all written over here, so I'm just going to copy and paste them in. Okay. Now, this is using Bootstrap classes, so we kind of want to look at how I've set that up. So I've got a few different divs here. They're each marked form group. Form group, as far as things are concerned, it says, hey, this is a group of controls. So generally speaking, in that form group, you should have 3 things: a label, an input field, or multiple input fields, and then an error message, place for an error message. Those should pretty much always be in your form groups. Does that make sense? That's a general pattern. You can just save that to memory. We'll be using that all semester. I have this NB-2 on there as well. What does that mean? Margin bottom, and then 2 says how much margin. So it can be from 1 being a small amount of margin to 5 being a larger amount of margin. You just kind of adjust it to what feels good for the form you're building on. So this form, 2 looks good. Other forms you might need 5, 3, but usually 2 or 3 is around the right number of margin between groups. Okay. So within that group, you can see I've got the label. I've specified the for attribute. Why have I specified the for attribute? What's that about?
That specifies which field the label's associated with.
Okay, and specifically it has to be what? What's the connection there? What's that value that has to match up?
The name.
It's not actually the name.
Miles driven.
It's actually the name.
Miles driven.
In terms of the
Is it the ID?
HTML, it's the ID, right? So the IDs here have to match up, right? If my ID of my text box is miles driven, I need to be miles driven up here, right? So just remember that. You want to make sure you remember that. For has to be matched up on the ID. Why does that matter? Well, because the name can be duplicated, right? And the name may not be the same thing as the ID. right? So we're saying match it up on the ID, and that's specifically for what? Is that for just normal people? Is that for people here like us?
No.
Who's the audience? Who uses that for?
Backend developers.
Huh?
Backend developers.
No, it allows you to click on the label and it will put
Oh.
focus on the field associated with it.
So that, yes, it does do that. If I click on the label, it'll put focus on the associated control, which is great. It's also for screen readers.
Yeah.
That's the other thing to remember. So this is also for people that can't see, people that are blind. So you want to make sure that that's an accessibility thing. Will it work out of the box without having that 4 there? Well, up here it'll work, but that needs to be there both for that reason, for the clicking, the focus, as well as for screen readers. So that's why that's there. Okay? Now, text box 4, I've specified, hey, I want the gallons used here, and then I specified I want to apply this class form control. So pretty much all the fields in your form you'll want to apply that bootstrap class form control. Anybody can tell me what controls I don't want to apply form control to? What forms do I not want to apply form control to? Huh? Okay, buttons 1. There's another 2, for sure.
Labels.
Okay, I don't want to apply form control to labels. Yep, there's a few more. Normally they're for anything that looks like an input box. What does not look like an input box?
Checkbox.
Like a text field. Checkboxes. So I'm not going to apply form control to checkboxes. I'm not going to apply it to radio boxes. So radio boxes, checkboxes, labels, all those things I won't apply form control to. Right? Because I don't want to them to look like text fields. But anything that looks like anything that should be like a text field, anything that's a drop down, I'm generally going to apply form control so it looks nice. Okay. Validation message. So I've got the validation message here. Validation message 4. You'll notice that same thing as up here. I have to put a null in here though. That second value is reserved for saying, I want to show this error message. So we want to make sure we leave that null so that it pulls those error messages that we've already generated from our attributes, from our validation attributes we defined on the model. If I put an actual string here, it's going to show that message regardless of whether or not there's a problem with the field. Okay. The reason I had to put that in is I wanted to specify that that is text changer, which is going to make that message red. That makes sense? So that's what that null is there. It's just that there's a version that takes 3 inputs, 3 arguments. There's not a version that takes 2. Okay, so those are my groups. I've got then one last group. Notice that I put the button in a form group itself, right? Is there a reason, anybody can think of a reason why I might want to put the button in a form group?
To link it to the input data. So like, because you do like a submit type button.
Okay.
And that data will automatically go to whatever connected database you may have or.
Oh.
So it takes up the same vertical space as the other rows?
That's a good rule. That's part of it. I want it to be similarly styled as the rest of the roles. I want the style to be similar. What if I have more than one button in there? What if I say I want to put a clear or a reset button in there? Right? I probably want it to be right next to the submit button. Okay? That's why I would do that. So I would recommend putting your submit buttons in a form group as well, so that if you ever need to add a reset or you have a reset, those will be next to each other, or if you have any other reason to have more than one button, that's why I would put a form group there. Okay. So we've got a basic setup there. Let me go run this and see what it looks like. So if I go to MPG Calc Index, that's where I'm at right now. You can see the field, it's all good. They're blank, right? They're blank, as I want them to be, okay? Now, sometimes I may need to initialize those values with some, those fields with some initial values. Sometimes I don't want them to be blank to start with. So say I want to do that. I'm going to say, let's edit, format the document. MPG Calc model. You'll notice it's not suggesting that class to me. You see that? Why is it not suggesting that class to me?
Yeah, you don't have a using statement for it?
I don't have a using statement for it. It doesn't know where it is. It doesn't know that it exists. But if I look now, I can go and add it there. So now I've added my using statement. Model equals new MPG Calc model. One question for review here. What am I calling here? I'm calling constructor, right? Did I ever define a constructor for this class?
No, but C# provides one for you automatically.
Which is called what? The default constructor. So the default constructor is always going to be there even if I don't provide one. What is the default constructor going to do? It still has to initialize all these properties, right? How is it going to initialize them?
Using through the center. Does it initialize them to their
What values is it going to set them to? So here in this model, what is miles driven going to be initialized to right now? No, right? If I leave this off, don't put the there, put the question mark there, what is it going to be initialized to?
0.
It's going to be initialized to 0, right? Okay, so let's say I take all of these off. I'm going to make these not allow null. So when I construct this model object, it's going to have zeros there, right? Okay, so let's pass that down to the view. Let's see what happens right now. Interesting. That's not because of what I changed, but it's because of where I ran it from, right? So what is my URL? I'm going to the root, right? What is it looking for? It's looking for a home controller, right? Do you have a home controller yet? No. Okay. Well, I can still go there right now, even though I don't have a home controller. We probably want to fix that, but I can go here, right? Just by typing it in the URL. Notice that the values have now started as 0, right? So that's one downside of, hey, leaving them nullable, right? Because it's got to initialize them to something. In this case, it's going to initialize them to 0. Okay. Why might that be interesting to me to start up with, hey, I'm going to create a model here. Well, let's say I want to go ahead and say the model miles driven is 200, model dot gallons used is 10. If I set it up this way, I should initially see those values here, right? So sometimes I want to initialize those to something meaningful to start with, in which case I'm going to go ahead and create a model right away and pass that down to the view, so I have some starting values. Okay?
So you only need to do that if you want to set
Right.
starting points.
If there's something that I don't want to be null, whatever the default value is, right, then I'm going to need to do that. Okay. Now you notice there, price per gallon started at 0, right? If I go back and put these in as nullable, that's the only thing I'm going to change. So now I've initialized miles driven to 200, gallons used to 10. I've left price per gallon uninitialized, right? So that's one of those reasons why you want to make sure it's nullable, right? Because otherwise you're going to get into cases where it's going to say, oh, well, let's start at 0. so we've got that basically set up. I'm actually going to comment that out because I don't, for this case, I'm not actually wanting that to start with any values. I want it to just look like that. Okay, so let's go back to our controller a minute and let's finish that up. There's still some more stuff we need to do on the view side, but I want to finish up the controller. Okay, so this first version, remember if I'm going to do handle the actual post that comes back, remember I need two versions of that method. One that's for get and one that's for post. So I'm going to mark this one as HTTP get. This is going to be the version that you get initially. I'm going to add another one for post, which is going to look like that. Okay, so I say this version is post, that version is get. This one takes a model, which is going to be wherever the user put in. I'm going to say if that model is invalid, if it's not valid, go ahead and show the view again. We don't want to go forward with any of the calculations, right?
And by saying index and model, you're keeping whatever they input in there.
Right, so whatever values they've already typed in, I'm just going to show those back to the user. Right, so I'm going to say show the index view, use that model, just like you saw I was using up here, I was showing some initial values to the user. Okay, so I can use a similar technique to put those values back out to the user. Okay, I'm going to then go calculate the things I need to calculate, assuming that's all good. Similar thing, re-show the index view with model. Okay. Now, if you called this action something else, let's say you called this action do thing, right? You'd probably end up calling your view as well as your action do thing, just trying to keep them the same thing. That's okay. The reason I'm using index here is because that's the first view you see when you get to that controller, right? So rather than if I called this do thing, what URL do I have to put into to get to it? I have to put in MPG Calculator /do thing. Or if I called this MPG Calc, I have to say /MPC Calc /MPC Calc. I don't want to duplicate that on the URL. I want to keep the URL similar, right? So by doing it as index, you can just type in /MPG Calc and get there. That makes sense? The reason I'm calling it index is because of the URLs, the shortened URLs. Okay, so let's run this real quick and let's see if this works. Start with no values. If I hit enter, great, I'm seeing my error messages. A reminder that's going through. I'm getting those error messages specifically because I told it this, right? If it's not valid, go back and show it. If I don't have it there, if I don't have that check there, I might not see my error messages because I'll go on with doing the thing, right? Redirecting them to the next page or whatever it needs to be, just like we saw with the party invites, right? I don't want to send the user to the next page if things aren't valid. Okay. So let's fill in some values here. 200, 10, price per gallon was 2. Okay, well my error messages are gone. I'm not seeing any output. Why am I not seeing any output?
Have you passed it to the view yet?
Let's take a look. I didn't pass it to the view. Well, I've done the calculation. I passed it on to the view, so that's not the problem. The view has the values.
You still don't have any way to display it.
I didn't put any code into here yet to display it, right? I didn't put a place for it to display that. Okay. So let's say I want to do that. Let's say I want to give it a place to show the output. Got a little bit of code here over to do that, and put that in like this. So I'm going to say your average MPG is model.mpg. Your trip cost is model.trip cost. That is blah, 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 cost per block. Okay. Now, you'll see there's a little bit more that I'm doing in here, right? So first of all, I've got an output tag here. What's the purpose of that output tag? Semantically, it's to give me, hey, these are things I'm going to output. If I wanted in the future to go use CSS to style all the outputs, that goes ahead and sets that up. So now I can just say, oh, style all the outputs this way, right? I want to use output anytime I have an actual output. Please, please, please don't use input when it's something you're giving back to the user, right? That is something that some people, if you're looking on Stack Overflow, you may see that answer. Don't use that. Input's only for inputs. Outputs should be out for outputs. Okay. Oftentimes, the other upside of doing that is now I could easily reference these in JavaScript. Let's say I give them all an ID. Now I can actually update them in JavaScript easily enough if I want to implement this entire form in JavaScript. Okay. What's going on here? What's going on here? So we've got an @sign. @sign says I'm doing something with Razor, which means the code that follows is going to be C#, right? Now you'll notice I have these outer parentheses, right? I'm using those outer parentheses to say my Razor starts here and it ends here. That's because in this case it's not something that MVC figures out automatically. If I leave those off, let's just see what that looks like, but you'll see that it doesn't look right. See how that's all turned white? It just thinks that's regular text, right? When you see white like that, it's all white, it means it just thinks that, oh, I'm just going to put that out directly, right? Okay, what I'm using here is what we call, it's a relatively new feature in C#. You may or may not have seen this in second semester. It's a very new feature, newer than what your textbook is. So we wouldn't have discussed it. Anybody remember string format? Remember string format? So it's basically a shorthand for string format. It works in a very similar way, okay, but it uses a different syntax. Okay. This $sign at the beginning of the string tells it that it is a template string. So $sign quotation mark says this is the start of a template string. Treat things special from now on. Okay. So it's going to treat this as a template string from here to the quote at the end. Make sense? Okay. The way I put that in now as a template string, I say, okay, model.mpg. That's simply just an expression to get the value. Right? And then after the colon is how I tell it what I want to format it as. Okay? So here's the value that I want to put out, and here's how I want to format it. Now, if you remember if I was doing this with string format, the syntax for that would look something like this. String format. Okay. This is the same as doing that. Okay. Those two things are the same thing. Okay. Either one, I won't take off points if you're doing it one way or the other. If you want to use string out format, use string out format. If you want to use template strings, use template strings. Either way. What changes you see here, see this 0 here? That 0 is saying grab the first argument. That 0 says grab the first argument, whereas I'm replacing that 0 with the actual value here. Does that make sense? That's the only thing that really changes between using string format and using a template string, is where you put the thing that you're going to put in, that you're going to substitute. Okay. Any questions on that at this point? Yeah.
Mine's running I can't get it to pop up the right view.
Okay, it's going to crash if I run it right now. It's going to crash if I run it right now. I know that. Okay. Any questions on template strings?
Well, it wasn't about that. It was about the other thing with the check mark on the next to your index to let you know. Because when I looked at it, it did exactly what you said. It told me to like create an error page. But can you go over again? How did you get to instead of making you send you to an error page to where it lets you know the errors, like put in some numbers by the boxes instead of sending you to an error page? Can you go over that again?
That's what it is. You can look at it again, but at this point, that should be relatively obvious because it's like the third time we've gone over it. So,
I did exactly
okay.
like that.
I can go with you on one-on-one, but I don't want to hold up everybody on that front because I think most people here have that working. But we can go over that one-on-one. So template strings, that's how I'm going to set that up. Okay. Now, let's talk briefly about the format side. Okay. So a few of these I've formatted as :C. You remember what that C stands for?
Is it currency?
Yeah, so C stands for currency. Well, what's that going to do? It's going to do two important things for me.
$sign.
It's going to add a $sign
It's going to format the decimal to.
as 2 decimal places. So the other nice thing that formatting as currency does, it actually goes and figures out what the culture of your server that you're running it on is and uses that. So if you were running this on a European server, this would actually show up as euros. If I was running it in China, it would actually show up as where the unit over there is. I think yen. Is yen? What's it in
It was yen
Japan?
like 5 years ago.
Okay, so it's going to show up as yen. So that's another helpful thing there. Could also be not helpful, right? Because maybe you still want it to show up in dollars, but just be forewarned, that's what it's going to do.
Or would it still use the conversion rates, or do you still have to do that server side?
You still have to do that server side. So if you have it in your database as $3, it's going to show up as €3, €3, $3. It's not going to do any conversion. It doesn't actually know the conversion ratios. It just knows how to format it. It knows nothing else. So it's just going to take that number and assume you have it in the correct currency. So just be forewarned of that. This other one, what is this doing? 0.0. The goal there is I wanted to tell it to format it so there's 1 decimal place. So that's going to do that. There's actually 2 ways for me to do that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, is it okay to use like N1?
N I think is for integers though. N is not the one you want. So you can either use F1 or 0.0. Both of those do the same thing. You can say floating point with 1 decimal, or you can say 0.0. Either of these will generate that. If I want 2 decimal places, I'm going to say F2 0.00. Either of those format strings work, and they will do the same thing. So take your pick, use either one. Whichever one you prefer, do that. But as a general rule, anytime you're spitting something out to the user, if it's a number, especially if it's a floating point number, always format it. Don't assume that it's going to have the right number of decimal places. Because if you don't, you'll find that it's got 10 or it's got 0. Either way, it's not going to be necessarily predictable as to what it is. So always tell it how many decimal places to format it out as. The other important thing, I'm telling it to format here on this side, telling it to format in the view. Where's the other place I could have formatted this? I could have formatted it in the model. That's possible. I could have also formatted it in the controller, right? So I could have done this formatting in the model. I could have done it in the controller. I could do it in the view. Why am I doing it in the view?
Because it's kind of like the data that you're giving or that you're showing the users, and it's like final state. You know, it's not going to be manipulated any further. So that's when you should do any type of formatting. You know, like
Well, there's a specific word. There's a technical word. It's what?
Presentation logic?
Yes, that's what I'm looking for. Scott, you had a hand up? Yeah. Well, it is a separation concerns thing. It is exactly what it is, right? But in terms of separation concerns, it falls under that bucket of presentation logic. And anything that falls under the presentation logic, we should do in the view. That makes sense? Because it's presentation logic, we should be doing it in the view. Okay. All right, let's run this real quick and let's look at what it's going to do. So if I try to run this right now, I'm seeing an exception, right? The important part here to note, what does it say here, right here? Null reference exception, okay? And it's actually telling me the line that the problem is, right? So I can tell this is in my view. Sometimes the problem might be in your controller, okay? So this is in my view. It's on this line, okay? And it's told me that something is null. What could be null?
Your .mpg is null?
My MPG could be null. Could the model also be null?
Yeah.
In this case, the model actually is null, right? The model is actually null. Now let me prove that to you. So if we look at the controller, right now I'm not passing a model, right? If I bring this code back in, we'll see that we don't get that error. See, I don't get that error this time. Difference being, hey, here I have a model initially, right? Versus with just this line, I don't have a model initially, right? So let's say I want to keep this. I don't actually want to give it a model right now. I'm deciding I don't want to give it a model initially. How can I keep that from crashing?
I thought I'd create
Alex?
a new model object as a argument for return view.
So you're saying that go back here and say new MPG Calc model? Yeah. Okay, that would solve the problem, and that would work just fine. That is a valid option. But how would I solve it? What are my other options?
If model design.
If what?
I think it's if model design equal null.
So if the model is not null. So I can put an if in there and say if there is an actual model, then I want to run that. I want to have that there. Otherwise I don't. Does that make sense? So I say only show that if there actually is a model.
So this is probably just a dumb question, but so at the very top when you're setting the model to the view with the @model.
That's not setting the model. It's setting the class that I expect that model to be in.
Oh,
right?
okay.
I'm saying the model that I'm given should be this class, should be an MPG Calc model.
Mhm.
It's not saying that I have a model.
So, okay.
It's not saying that the model is required. It's just saying if you give me a model, it must be this class. Okay? But I don't have to give you a model.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because like when you're initially getting it, there's no instance of the model because there's no actual data.
Right. So there's no actual model initially here. Okay. So I may need to do that check. All right. So let's run this now and see what this looks like. So if I say calculate, initially there's no error. If I say calculate, still no error, but you'll notice that the values show up here. Even though there's an error, it'll show up there because now there is a model. Once I posted it back, that there is a model in the post version. Does that make sense? So as soon as I post it, the act of it coming in here, it's going to take whatever inputs are and create a model off of that. So simply because I've said this method takes a model, MVC's gone ahead and created a model for me. Okay. So what if I don't want these values to show up until the user's entered all the values?
In the if statement, you would check the values instead of the model.
Right. Well, I want to check the model as well. Okay? I want to check the values as well as the model. So let's say I put it in here and I say, we'll only show this if the model's null and the MPG is not null. Okay? What's the reason that I still need this one? What's it gonna What's it gonna do if I have just this code here? Remember,
Well, it'll always.
what was the reason that I initially checked for that I need to put the model in as null? It was crashing. Okay, let's look at this. If I just do this, it's still going to crash. It's still going to crash because model is null. Because when I say model.mpg, I'm doing what I call dereferencing. I'm having to dereference the model and ask for the MPG. In that process, it's already crashing, right? Simply asking for what's the value of MPG requires there to be a model object. Does that make sense? So I have to check that there's a model object first before I go to that other check. Okay? Now, does the order of those two checks matter?
Yes.
Yes.
Why?
Sequencing, pretty much. I mean, model.mpg shouldn't exist if the model doesn't exist, so.
Right? Because if I reorganize those, and I put that second check there, this is still going to crash. It's still going to crash because it's going to go from left to right. It's going to go run this and say, oh, sorry, I don't have a model. It's just going to crash. But why does it work the other way? Why doesn't it just go through and do all the checks?
If you're using and, it will stop when it reaches the first false.
Okay, stop because it reaches the first fault. What do we call that? What do we call that? We call that shortcutting, right? We call that shortcutting, or short-circuiting. We say, okay, when we've got NAND, it's going to look for the first one that's false and then not run the rest. That's really helpful because cases like this happen all the time, where I need to say, is the base thing null or not, and then go check some properties on it. Right? Without that short circuiting, this would still crash. I would have to actually break it into two ifs if it weren't for short circuiting. Right? So the order there matters. The order matters because I'm taking advantage of short circuiting. Okay? I'm also going to want to put, I may want to put in additional checks and actually check all three of the values. Potentially, depending on what my circumstance is. So for this, I'm going to say, is the model not null? Is the MPG set? Is the trip cost set? Is the cost per mile? Only show the outputs if all of those things are good. So let's go run that, just make sure that works. So if I look at this here, calculate, there's no initial value there. Put some values in, and there's my values. And we can see if I leave just one of those values out, it's not there. All good. Does that make sense as to what I'm doing there, why I'm putting an if around that? I think that's all the code I have for that. I do believe that's all the code.
Can you show us like style?
How-
I can get the styling work correctly.
As far as,
Well, I finally got it working, but everything was like off center.
I would just leave it like this. I would leave it at this point. That looks good enough. It's going to work just fine on mobile. It's going to work just fine on desktop. I would actually just leave it here like this. I know the screenshot that I had originally had it with the labels and the input fields like this.
Yeah.
That unfortunately is really hard to do in Bootstrap. I mean, the mockup was initially done for Windows Forms, which in Windows Forms you're dragging and dropping things. That's not too hard to do. It's a real pain to get that to work on Bootstrap, so I'm not going to bother. Because I'd rather have you make your forms this way anyway, as far as this class is concerned. That make sense?
Yep.
I'd rather have you do them this way. And that takes a lot less work than doing the other way as well. It also, the other big upside, if I do things like this, let's say I want to translate it into another language, such as Spanish. Anybody know that Spanish has a lot more longer words usually than English, right? Spanish is usually a lot longer. So where I might have this be the longest thing, and then I could assume, okay, let's build it just for English. I put my inputs here. Okay, it works fine for English, but now for Spanish, it breaks because they're too long for whatever reason, whether it's breaking it down onto multiple lines or some of the text is being cut off. Having them next to each other does not work well when you have translations, versus having them on top works really well if you're going to translate it into another language. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I prefer to have it this way for that reason. Is it works better for mobile, it works better for translations. We'll have less trouble actually doing it that way. Okay. Other questions about this? Does that give you enough to understand any problems you might have had with the temperature converter as well? Asking were you still having problems? Did that resolve all of them? Oh, right. Yeah, let's see.
It'll do.
Fahrenheit, but it doesn't do.
Yeah, I like
It's because of this. We've done 1 divided by 8. Those are integers. Remember, 1 and 8 are integers. You divide that, you get 0. So you're actually dividing by 0 right now. That needs to be the value that I gave you instead of 1 over 8. So problem is you're dividing by 20. Okay. One thing I didn't go over here, and I definitely need to. If I go to the home page right now, there's nothing there, right? So as a general rule, any website you build should have a home page. Should always have a home page. Why do you need a home page?
So it can be indexed.
Well, it can be indexed. That's one reason.
So.
As far as the search
won't
engine is
error out?
concerned. Won't error out. If the user goes to your website and they see this, do you think that they're going to go try to find any other pages on your website? No. They'll assume you have a garbage website and just leave, right? So we always need to have a home page of some sort, right? So for this project, I'm going to create a very, very simple home page. And all that home page is going to do is give me links to the actual parts of the website. So to do that, I'm going to add another controller called Home Controller. Again, specifically, that needs to be called Home Controller. I can't call it anything else. It needs to be Home Controller. So I'm going to go ahead and add Home Controller. I'm going to add a view for that.
Is this for the mouse go down?
This is the home page. So I'm going to have that Home Controller. This should be for both of those. Scott, this should be both for MPG Calc as well as your temp converter. What I want on that page, where's home? There it is. A, something like that. So I'm going to give it a title. I'm going to have an H1 just to tell me what is this website. And then I'm just going to put some links in an ordered list to the other pages. So to give those links, I'm going to use html.actionLink. ActionLink is the way you refer to another page on your website. Anytime you want to link between different pages on the website, just use ActionLink. This is going to generate what kind of tag?
An anchor tag?
An anchor tag. And so if I look at it in the browser, there'll just be an A tag here. That's it. Okay. So here's the text that I want to go in there. There's the name of the action. There's the name of the controller. Similar thing. Link text, action, name of controller. Right? So why is this index here? Why is that called? Why is that index? Well, that's because I've called the action index. Right? If I called the action MPG Calc, I need to put MPG Calc there. That makes sense? If I called it foobar, I need to put foobar there. And then similar thing, MPG Calc. Notice that I leave off the word controller, right? The class is called MPG Calc Controller, but when I set up these links, I'm not actually going to put the controller suffix in there.
Okay, so the first argument is the value, it's actual text that you see.
Yep, the actual text that the user sees.
The second one is the view page,
No, the name of the action.
the name of the action.
The name of the action.
Oh, okay.
Right? What's the difference between the name of the view and the name of the action? So the name of the action, that's the name of the method here.
Right, yeah.
Right? That's the action name. Okay? That could easily be something else if I said this is details, right? If I go to MPG Calc index, I'm going to get the index action, but the details view.
How it knows the specific index, because if you have multiple indexes, how does it, because it's because of the controller you're using? That's how it knows?
Well, this is get,
Right,
right? Anytime I follow a link, it's going to go through get.
right.
Any link will go through as a get request. Just like typing it into the URL into the browser will always go through get. Does that make sense? So it knows based on the method, it's going to go look for that action, and then at the end of this, the action actually determines what view I see, right?
Let's say you have an index on MPG Calc and you have an index on temperature converter and you have an index on home. That's when you need to specify the controller.
No. It's not because I have multiple indexes.
Okay.
So if I don't specify the controller, it will assume that it's going to the same controller that I'm currently on.
Okay.
Which controller am I currently on? I'm currently on home. So if I don't specify that, it's going to go to home index.
Right.
If I don't specify that controller, it's going to assume that the controller is the same as wherever you are.
Right, okay.
Okay. So the place where you can leave that off is if you're just navigating within that same controller,
Right, okay.
which is pretty frequent, and this is why they give you that option. But if I'm navigating between controllers, from one controller to another, I have to tell it which controller to go to. And that works out, even though I may have 3 index views here, I'm telling it which controller. So there's only one index view for MPG Calc, there's only one index view for home, there's only one index view for temp converter. That's all okay. Does that make sense? So that's how I'm going to set up that home page. You just give a few links to the other pages.
So I made an action link that has like the actual file path. It's like / this / that. So is it preferred to do that way?
You prefer to do that way
Okay.
as an action link.
It's more readable, I'm assuming. Yeah.
Well, the reason we want to do it this way, it's not actually having to do anything with readability. It actually has to do with routing.
Right.
So remember we have that routing file that we can change?
Yes.
We may create special shortcuts for this thing has a special, more readable URL. If I use action link, it will turn it into that more readable format automatically.
Right.
It will go look at our routing configuration, figure that out. If I spell it out directly as just write the A tag out, it's not going to look at my routing table at all and fix it up
Oh, okay.
for me.
Okay.
So the reason I want to use action link is because that lets me customize the routing paths later on. Okay, so that's that. The next thing I wanted to look at is to look at smooth scrolling. Okay, so this is the way that I would write that code to set that up to work with a single page. So you'll see at the top, first I'm calling Scroll Spy. Scroll Spy is part of Bootstrap. So, and you'll also notice that this is using jQuery. So make sure wherever you put the script has to be after both Bootstrap and jQuery are loaded. Otherwise this won't work. Okay? So I'm saying go off the body, apply Scroll Spy, target wherever ID I've applied to my navbar so it knows where to look. That's going to say, okay, watch where you're scrolling, highlight the ones in this, highlight the links in this navbar based on where your scroll position is. I've also specified an offset of 56. What that's going to do is move it up a little bit so that the links become active sooner, if that makes sense. As I'm scrolling down, they'll become active sooner instead of being already you've passed over the header, right? Because otherwise it would normally hide, okay, here's the section of the header, you scroll down there, but now it's off screen, right? So that's going to keep it on screen. This value you can make whatever you want. I would generally recommend a value in the range of 50 to 70. Okay, 56 is usually a pretty good number, but it's going to be 50 to 70.
Where's this code at? Is this,
I've uploaded this to both the Lab 1 and Lab 2. So if you look under the attachments to Lab, Worksheet Lab, sorry, 1B, 1A and 1B, they're both, it's up there.
Did you say before the script? Or
So this needs to be after Bootstrap and after jQuery, because both of those are needed. Scroll Spy is part of Bootstrap. This obviously is depending on jQuery as well. Okay.
You just paste that into the body?
So this I'm going to put in a separate JavaScript file. It'll probably be my main JS or whatever. So I'm going to put that under the content folder. Okay. The next bit of code, so this just sets up so the links get highlighted. This part sets it up so it actually scrolls smoothly down to whatever section I want it to go to. Okay. So let's start with this first. So we've got a jQuery selector. I'm saying anything that has this class, js-scroll-trigger. It doesn't have to be that. give it whatever class you want to, okay? There's a few different ways, there's a lot of different ways to do this. If you looked on Stack Overflow, you'll see a different one there. I prefer this one because it gives me more control over how and when it activates. So if I put this class, this custom class on any link, then this will activate for that link. If I don't put it there, it'll just automatically jump there. So that way I control which ones I want this behavior to apply to. The other thing I could do here, if I just wanted this to apply to all the links in the navbar, I could just put this in as navbar dash link. Right? If I just want everything in the navbar to jump there, we'll just put that in as navbar link because I already have to apply that class for Bootstrap. Okay. The downside of doing it that way, if I ever have something in the navbar that I don't want to be smooth scrolling, it won't work for that link. Right? Whereas if I use another class, then I can apply that class to the links I want to scroll and the link and not apply it to links I don't want to scroll. That make sense? So that gives me more control by doing that. Okay, so I say when you click on that link, first of all, I want to prevent default. That's going to prevent just some graphical glitches. If I don't have that there, you'll see the link kind of jitter a little bit. Next thing I want to do here, navbar collapse time. That's specifically for mobile devices. Remember, if I run it on a mobile device, it has a navbar that's kind of expanded. You click the hamburger to expand it. That line of code will collapse it back to the hamburger. Okay. If you look on Stack Overflow for this code, you won't find that line. Fair forewarning. But that is something you want to have in there, because otherwise on mobile devices, the navbar will still stay open when you click on the link. Does that make sense?
So where do you put the navbar collapse class?
This should actually already be in your navbar. If you follow through the Bootstrap tutorials, that class should already be there. If you follow through Bootstrap 4, that should already be there. You've got another Bootstrap method, which is collapse, and that just says collapse it. So yeah, you should have that already. The only class I had to add in addition to what Bootstrap gave me is whatever I call this class here, which I'm saying JS scroll trigger. Okay? So prevent the default, collapse the navbar if it's open, and then I'm doing here. Now, I'm falling back to vanilla JS to do this because there's part of what I need here isn't actually in jQuery. So to get this offset top property, I can't actually go, same thing for this hash, I have to follow back, basically I have to fall back to vanilla JS to get these two things, which is why I'm going to do this next line in vanilla JS. So I'm just going to say go grab the target, go grab the link that I clicked on, or sorry, not the link that I clicked on, but the thing that the link is going to. So this .hash says, okay, this, remember in jQuery, is relevant to the click. It's relevant to what event I'm in, right? So when I did click, this becomes the thing I clicked on, the link I clicked on. Does that make sense? Clicked on the link I clicked on. So .hash gives me that ID that's in the link. So if it's saying I want to go to hashtag about me, this will be hashtag about me. Okay, I put this into document.querySelector and it pops out the element with that ID, right? So this target is the element that we want to scroll to. Okay. Next thing I want to do is say animate the HTML, animate the scrolling. We're going to set scroll top to this little formula here. So take the thing I want to scroll to, the section title, take the offset top. So that's offset top is how many pixels is it from the top of the page, okay? And subtract by offset here, subtract 56. That's going to mean when I scroll down, it stops on top of the link instead of scrolling so the link isn't visible, right? because that offset is the bottom of that text, bottom of that line of text that I'm scrolling to. So give it an offset, tell it to do that animation over a second. You can tune that number to whatever makes sense to you, but this is in milliseconds, so that's 1 second.
So what's the difference between using the $sign and using query selector?
$sign query selector. So if I use the $sign, I get back a jQuery wrapped object, versus if I do document query selector, I get back the element as a raw vanilla JS item. Does that make sense? So this gives me the raw vanilla JS element. Using the $sign would give me back the item with the jQuery wrapper around it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that would actually change this line of code, because the offset top property is not there on the wrapper. Does that make sense? So it changes this line of code where I'm just pulling the vanilla JS item. And then, so this is how long it takes to do the animation. Swing is the curve for that animation, which means it's going to kind of start slow, speed up, and then slow down. If I don't specify that or I leave it as linear, it's just going to be flat, same speed the whole way through. Changing that is, I definitely would recommend it, just because it makes it feel a lot more smooth. It doesn't have to be swing, but the only two that are provided by default with jQuery are linear and swing. There are other animation curves out there, but you usually have to pull in a plugin to get a different animation curve. Does that make sense? Any questions on this? So you can pretty much use this anytime you need it. Anytime you need the smooth scrolling, that's all you need.
Yeah, mine is just not working.
It's not working?
It's just doing nothing.
Doing nothing?
So like this line is supposed to offset where it leads to, so which it doesn't do.
Okay.
So it goes, so like here like where it was linking before, it's linking to the same spots.
Yeah. Can you first of all do a control F5 on that? And let's make sure that you're looking at the same file. So this is home index, and this is also home, should be home index.
Yeah, just that.
Okay. Oh, because you haven't applied that class.
Okay.
So you need to go back up to the links and actually in your nav bar and apply that class.
So
be JS-filter if you're using it as that. Again, the other option is you can just change that class to be nav-filter.
Yeah, I tried to use nav-link. It didn't work for some reason.
Does it put another change to the offset to the scroll spot though?
Yeah, I don't know what the problem with scroll flag is then.
That works.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's up.
So it goes on the class construct.
Like it got moved higher up.
This is where it should be.
For some reason my CSS is not really, it's like not compiling. It's not updating.
Press Control
You
F5.
need to do a control F5 in the browser. Sometimes just careful warning, sometimes you're in your browser, you make a CSS change. Just doing F5, which is normally a refresh, doesn't always update the CSS files, and we have to do control F5. Because sometimes the browser thinks, oh, there's no new CSS changes, I'm not going to open it.
script at the bottom, and the script that I just added goes at the very bottom. I could have. I just see.
Control that one.
Oh, you can do this.
Well, here, on page, control.
Yeah, I figured it out. Had two different projects. I had two different projects for one, that was first good. That's typically the solution. Just a heads up. We had, oh, it was, you got calculation for Celsius? I put, 1/8, like 1 divided by 8, because I thought that's what it was, 1.8. Literally that was.
And let's look to make
So
sure.
I was dividing by 0, because it 1/8 turned it in, yeah, so I divided by 0, and then it just,
Okay.
go infinity. Yeah.
I didn't look at it.
Right, but I guess let's run this. I think what's going to happen is
Yeah,
that
cause I thought that's what it was.
I think the government's going to go. So let's go with a source.
We're just doing this, we're getting this in.
I know that usually works sometimes in the
Is that separate from your survey project?
Yeah, I did it completely separate.
So they're coming in that JS out.
Yeah. I literally have you used the Kraken links?
About project. What's this about? So remember, SRO is screen reader only. So it would be text that was only for the screen reader. Which
I think I got that from that.
okay.
That big show.
You'll need to put that. You'll need to put that in there if you're like saying show this. Basically, like show this text for screen readers instead of. So it doesn't make sense here because the home is going to be showing you the right. That would be what you might do if you're in SRO. You might say, oh, I only want to show an icon, in which case I move home into there. So for regular users, you just see home icon, no text.
So now the offset started working.
Okay. Just magically?
Yeah. I don't understand. It's working now.
You can't use tilde. I know that's what you major syntax. No, in your image you're not using display block.
We have
That's
some
what
version
system
of
stuff
that.
with.
I'm not sure.
This is not the same. I used a different
Let's go on break now. Come back at 2:15.
should scroll through.
So one thing of note, and we had an issue on Dalton's machine. I have an issue in my JavaScript. So here's the fixed 2 lines. Yes, we do need to go through jQuery. As it turns out, the vanilla JavaScript, this offset top property, is not reliable in vanilla JavaScript. So we do have to go through jQuery to fix that. So these are the 2 lines I'd recommend you use instead. Put the $sign there to get the jQuery object, and then here do offset as a method .top. That will give you the right value.
Is that updated on your inside of LinkedIn as well?
Yeah, I pushed up the updated code to inside of Maintenance. So it's up there now. So that solved that problem.
I have an unrelated question.
Mm-hmm.
So I have excused I have a doctor's notes and stuff to get unexcused absences excused. So should I just wait until like I run into a problem with my attendance?
So the rule currently for that, there are no excused absences.
Right.
Basically.
Okay.
So there are no excused absences. You are allowed 6 absences in the semester, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once you get to your 7th, you can do an appeal to stay in the class, right?
Okay.
So if you get to 7 absences, that's the point where you'll submit that paperwork.
Okay, so up until then I should.
Up until then, just hang on to it,
Yeah.
and you'll give that to the committee
Mhm.
when that time comes.
Okay.
So if you get to 7 absences, that's where you present the paperwork. Otherwise, I don't take that paperwork anymore.
Right. Okay.
So I used to keep track of that paperwork. I don't keep track of that paperwork anymore. So you were asking about multi-line text. So let's say I want to have a field in there. I'm just going to use for purposes in there, because you may want to have, I think for your portfolio, I'd ask you to do projects and things like that. You want project description, you want multi-line text. So the way I might do that, let's say I put in public string okay, simple start, right? So just a value in there. Hey, I'm going to have a field. I'm going to go ahead and put that on the view. So let's say I want to create another field there. We'll call it description. So I've got a description field here, but you'll see that it's only 1 line tall. I can't, if I hit enter, it's actually going to submit the form. But I'd like to be able to actually put multiple lines of text in there. In order to do that, now the typical way that we would do that is we're actually going to add something to the model. It's called data type. Multi-line text. So that's going to tell it that it should treat this, whatever editor it generates should be multi-line text.
If you have a required, is it attribute? Or?
I may want to have required in there right now. Required. Right now I'm not putting that in there because I'm just trying to show it. Now, you can see that it's not working. It's not working. So that's because there's kind of there's different ways to set things up. So if I say here text area 4, that's the easiest way to do it. Just say text area instead of text box, right? So text area would be more than 1 line of text, which is that's going to solve it. In the future, we'll be using this, and the way that I think you have to do editor 4. So if you're using editor 4, that's where you're going to see that attribute.
So if you used.
So, but text area 4 is where I'd suggest you go right now.
So
That
you
makes
don't
sense.
need that for our model.
So I don't need that on the model. I don't need that attribute on the model. In the future, that's how we'll do it. So I would recommend, there's a bunch of these. I would recommend going through this whole list and taking a look at them, just because there are so many of these that are useful. And there's pretty much one for every kind of control that you would ever want.
Now, what was the 2 lines of code that you were supposed to change in JavaScript?
I've already I posted them up under the assignment.
I checked it, still was bold one.
Do a control. Go back to the assignment. No, that's it. Yeah. So these, the common 2 line, that's the only ones. These are any ones.
So is it Bootstrap that specifies the height for the text area?
It's HTML. So if you want the height of the text area to be taller, remember what property you set? You remember what property you set to make the text area taller? It's called rows. So if I want it to be 5 rows tall, I just put in there, say, rows equals 5.
Now, what is that? Is that an HTML attribute?
That's an HTML attribute.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's all you got to set to make it taller, is just set an HTML attribute in there. So I would say the original plan was maybe to get into chapter 4. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and push that back to tomorrow so you guys can finish up the stuff you're working on. So I'm actually going to go over chapter 4 and 5 is going to be my plan for tomorrow. We'll see if we get through both, but that'll be my plan for tomorrow, is to go through both 4 and 5. Any questions?